Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here at my next Avatar Weekly discussion topic video. This week the topic is going to be a kind of discussion on the four villains of Korra, and kind of using that, the analysis of each of the four villains and their motivations to kind of explain to you, I suppose, my general opinion on Korra as to why I kind of prefer book 1 and 2, especially on the villain front, over book 3 and 4, which seems to be a kind of reversal of, in general, what most people feel about the series. So that's the topic, but I'll say it right here at the beginning of the video. If you want to get more involved with these Avatar Weekly discussion topic videos, you can do so by supporting my channel on Patreon. I have a variety of kind of tiers available, one of which, obviously, if you kind of pledge enough as a patron, you can just flat out choose what you want the discussion topic to be for a week. Another one of them is that you can choose what you want me to discuss on the video one of the weeks, and then you can also choose a second topic that you can come on with me on Skype and actually discuss the topic with me. It'll be a kind of podcast thing, that will be the video, me talking to you about that topic more of a discussion thing. That's fun. And then like some of the other ones involve like choosing topics for the podcast and stuff like that. Definitely check out my Patreon, link in the description, and that's a way you can get involved more with these videos. But anyway, let's get into the topic here. The villains of Korra. So we'll start off with book 1, of course. So our main villain, I'll deal with the main ones, and so that means I won't be discussing Tarlok all that much here. But obviously Amon, or Noatak, is his real name. The key thing here is that really threatening villain, of course, but once we get his backstory, we understand his motivations. That the big thing we learned, obviously, in Korra Book 4, and subtly during each of the books about the main villain, was that they all had a fundamental, good ideal that became corrupted over time, that they took it too far. With Amon, it was the idea of equality, that are benders, do they have too much power, and do they use that power to gain an advantage over people who aren't benders? And that was the kind of valid point, fighting for that freedom in a city that was kind of becoming overrun with stuff like the bending triad kind of committing a lot of crimes and so on. So that it sort of made sense kind of where that whole idea kind of came from. But for him personally, as a bender, where did it come from for him? Why did he believe so strongly that, even though he's a super strong bender himself, that he had to do what he had to do to kind of get rid of it? And that's obviously because when in his family life, the second it was found out that he and his brother were waterbenders by their father Yakone, that kind of changed everything. It went from being a happy family dynamic, Yakone getting a second chance at life again and having a chance for kind of a peaceful life away from crime, but it came back. And this is ultimately the kind of tragic backstory of this family, that Yakone just couldn't leave that old life behind. He wanted revenge against Aang, and used basically his kids, once he found out there were waterbenders, as kind of tools for his revenge. He primarily then focused on training them as waterbenders, bloodbenders, and then teaching them the secret technique of psychic bloodbending / bending without the need of the full moon. And he pushed them so hard, basically, that it really did change their personalities, kind of implanted this kind of this need to do stuff later on in their life. Primarily, of course, the idea that neither of them ever wanted to help their father commit his revenge against the Avatar, but in their own way ended up kind of doing something along the lines of that. And that Tarlok, even though he was the much more sympathetic character in the flashback, ended up like kidnapping Korra and was planning something crazy there. And then obviously Amon had the whole conflict against Korra, so they ended up both combating against her, despite initially planning never to really do that. So that's the first thing. But then the other one is just the way the kind of family dynamic ended up working out, that because Noatak was the more talented one, he took on so much of the pressure from Yakone, the expectations that he had to be what Yakone wanted. Whereas Tarlok, got a bit of abuse, of course, for not being as strong as Noatok, but in general got kind of glossed over because it was just expected. Oh, he's the weaker one, he's not doing as well, that's expected, let's focus more on you. And if you get the idea that if Noatok ever messed anything up, he would get a lot of abuse, and so that changed his personality from being a fairly caring person to being more kind of cold and distant and stuff like that, as is explained. And from there, obviously as the betrayal happens and Noatok leaves, you completely understand basically his whole kind of ideals, in that what happened in this moment was that the kind of family fell apart. He didn't agree with what Yukon was doing with them and left, and had this whole idea about what is true power, and he didn't see true power as being psychic bloodbending, which is a super powerful ability to us, but for Noatok Amon, he always felt that the more powerful ability was the one that took away Yukon's bending in the first place, the power of the Avatar via energy bending to take away people's bending. And even though we never got it explained to us, the details of how he developed that technique, you get this idea that he left and researched that a lot, that this is where the plan came from. The whole equalist movement and stuff like that came fundamentally from his desire to do something like that, have an ability like that, so he could take other people's bending away, combined with the fact that he believed that bending kind of ruined his life, his brother's life, the whole family's life, and his need to kind of equalize kind of the world by kind of removing bending from everyone effectively. So it's a well explained backstory in that episode, Skeletons in the Closet, and you completely understand why he did. Like, obviously he got so into it that he ended up lying and kind of joining this movement that honestly believed in it, but obviously he was lying to them. And you get the idea that, like, maybe he could have done something if he was just truthful from the beginning, that he was a bender, but that he believed in better equality for non-benders. But obviously the way he went about it, like, it's not fair to just take everyone's bending away just because you think it's it's an ability they shouldn't have, because as we see, when people get their bending taken away, it's part of them. When it's taken away from them, it changes them. Like, they're suddenly very weak because they're so used to having that kind of energy inside them that it's a really kind of tragic thing when it's taken away from them. For, like, obviously Korra especially, that's her kind of whole life, basically, bending and being the Avatar. And for so many others, it's the same. Like, he took away a lot of the pro benders bending, and that's another thing for them. So, huge kind of thing about what he did there. You can see the fundamental goal, that there was a lack of equality in the city, but the way he approached doing it was very wrong. So he's kind of really well done. Like, he's a strong character, his backstory is really well done, and just overall it works out nicely. And then Tarlok, of course, taking the better approach, where he had kind of more time with the family afterwards, but obviously Yukon, after Noatok left, he didn't train Tarlok anymore, so that's why Tarlok is not as powerful as Noatok and so on, but he still went about doing things in that way. So his is really well done. Unalaq, I think a lot of people don't give any credit to for being any sort of an interesting or good villain. I personally put a lot of analysis into him and think that he's a really strong villain, and one of the more detailed villains that we know about, and that there's a lot of complexities to kind of what he's going through. But obviously, fundamentally, you have this character who is the chief of the Northern Water Tribe, chief of the Southern Water Tribe, and leader of the Red Lotus, as we kind of later find out. Now, the thing with him, of course, is that he's primarily a very spiritual man. His fundamental goal, his ideal that is good that became corrupted, was just to bring spirituality back into the world that, in his mind, had sort of lost it. And that's most highlighted with the fact that the southern and northern lights at the two portals, even though at the start of the Korra series, at the start of book 2, Unalaq explains that the northern lights are present in the north, and even though the northern portal isn't open at that time, they are spiritual enough to the point where their spirits are peaceful. In the south, though, it's a different story. Their portal is closed, the southern lights aren't there anymore, and the spirits are angry because of what happened in the past. And obviously we later find out that that's primarily caused by Unalaq and what he did to basically get his position as chief of both tribes, and kind of taking that position ahead of Tonraq, his brother. So, you have this really interesting character who has his own ideals, and then has these complex issues with his family members, like his father, like his brother, and later on his niece in Korra. So there's a lot of things going on here, and going back to that flashback, obviously you get the idea that in his mind the better chief would have been himself, as being a more spiritual person. That's a better thing to have than being a kind of brutish warrior type like his brother, who would potentially lead the tribe to war or something like that. Let's remember, this is kind of earlier Tonraq, before he had kind of changed, and Tonraq was kind of anti-spirit early on, and he obviously, in Unalaq's mind, he felt that was a bad thing to do. Again, went about it in a very bad way, kind of manipulating these situations to get himself into a strong position as like the spiritual savior of the North, saving them from the kind of almost tragedy caused by Tonraq. Tonraq gets banned, goes to live in the South, starts a family, and then that links into the other interesting thing that Unalaq has going on, that is a subtle point, but that he always kind of wanted to have the Avatar as his own child, that this is another goal he has on his side, that he wants the world to be spiritual, but he also would like it if he could have the Avatar on his side of things, like going under his ideals and believing the same things that he believed in. So obviously it's very clear that he wished that his own child was born to be the Avatar, and then once he found out that his brother, in a really for really ironic moment for Unalaq, like, what bad luck that his brother, the non-spiritual one, was the one who had the Avatar as his daughter. And so from there he tries to restart things with Tonraq and basically get close to Korra, but Tonraq obviously gets in the way consistently, and that leads to obviously the first Red Lotus kidnap attempt against Korra, which is obviously Unalaq ordering Zahir, Ghazan, Minghua, and Pali to attack the Southern Water Tribe to take her. And this is obviously the fight where who is it? I think it's Zuko, Sokka, Tenzin, and Tonraq, plus one or two others, I think, defend Korra from them. Now, we don't have any details of this battle. Some people speculate that Sokka perhaps was killed here. Not really sure about that, but it's definitely a decent theory. But obviously it ended up with the Red Lotus being captured, and Unalaq going as far to hide his cover that he was the one who ordered this attack, as to have Pali imprisoned in the north in her ice prison. And this obviously has changed the plan once again. But obviously the clever aspect of Unalaq is that he later uses this. He uses the fact that this changed Korra's early life, in that obviously the protection suddenly went up in the Southern Water Tribe. Korra had to be protected. The walls went up. The Avatar compound became a really big thing. She wasn't allowed to go out, really, and lived a very isolated life growing up, and was told that the reason for this was that because Aang wanted her to be safe, so she had to be trained in one spot instead of traveling the world, whereas in fact it was actually a response by Tenzin and Tonraq to what happened with the attack, and them deciding that it would be best to keep her this way, and they lied to her her whole life. He later uses this, obviously, the details of this, that they lied to her about the exact nature of why she was isolated, and got her on his side at the start of book 1, and kind of manipulated Korra into opening the 2 spirit portals over the course of book 2, and that would help to accomplish his goal, which was, as a member of the Red Lotus, fundamentally to bring Vatu back into the world, free him, and live in an era of chaos where spirits weren't, I suppose, separated from the world, because Unalaq's kind of, I suppose, the ideal you would perhaps least agree with him on is this idea that he feels like the world would actually be better in an era of chaos and darkness rather than an era of light and peace, because he disagrees with the idea of the Avatar sealing the spirit portals to separate humans from spirits, which ultimately is the thing that Korra learns in book 2, which is obviously that it is actually a better thing at this point in time to attempt to bridge that gap between humans and spirits. some space was needed, I think. Juan, I think, at the time was correct in separating them, because humans had just lived such an isolated experience themselves, that the spirits had taken over most of the physical world, that they needed to kind of just have some time to themselves to kind of, just live in their entire world again. But now is obviously time to fix that. And without Unalaq teaching Korra what he did teach her to be spiritual, we wouldn't have got to that point. So I think it's a very important kind of point there, that obviously, with Unalaq, the things we don't know, like with Amon, the fact that we don't know how exactly he came up with the technique to take people's bending away, nor do we know where he got the mask from, or when he met Hiroshi. The things we don't know about Unalaq are basically when he first came into contact with Vaatu, and also when he first became involved in the Red Lotus. We don't know those exact details, but obviously they're the little bits of his story that are still fun to speculate on. But we, at a base level, know why he has the ideals he does. He's spiritual, he comes from the north, it's a more spiritual tribe, and he really believes that spirituality is key to the world being a better place, that humans and spirits should live together. But the corruption is obviously the whole Red Lotus aspect of things, where he believes more in Vaatu than Rava and the Avatar. Though he did obviously want Korra to be on his side so he could train her in his way. Obviously, the whole idea of the kind of dark, good Avatar being that it would be Korra trained by those Red Lotus members, in the sense of like Minghua and Unalaq as her kind of waterbending teachers, plus Unalaq giving the spirituality. Zahir also involved in the spirituality, and because he studied airbenders, he could teach her airbending, even though he wouldn't have had it at that point. Ghazan as her earthbending teacher, Pali as her firebending teacher, and you would have had like a very different kind of Korra if she was kidnapped during any of these points, or influenced much earlier on in her life by Unalaq. I think it's almost, you get the impression that Unalaq put himself forward as like, I should be Korra's waterbending teacher or spiritual teacher much earlier on in her development and training, and they decided no, Katara is going to be her teacher. Unalaq, obviously with Tonrock's opinion on Unalaq, would not want him involved at all. So I think Unalaq is very well developed. The jealousy of his brother, the want to have the Avatar on his side, and the connection to Vaatu. And then obviously the key tragic ending for him is that he gives himself so completely over to Vaatu in kind of devotion to the cause that he basically loses himself. Like, Vaatu just kind of completely takes over, and Unavaatu is basically 99% Vaatu, like 1 or even less percent Unalaq. He's basically not part of that thing anymore. Unlike the Avatar, which is more 50-50 human spirit. So yeah, that's Unalaq, and you can see that they're pretty well developed in terms of the concepts that they're going for. You may not like the characters individually, in terms of like, oh, Amon, maybe he's too much speaking on the microphone and stuff like that. Unalaq maybe not charismatic enough, but their backstories, their motivations for why they do what they do is explained. And that's why I like the villains from book 1 and 2 so much, because they link so heavily in with what the book deals with. It's going to be a little bit different now talking about the villains from the latter half of the series. So let's talk about the book 3 villains, book 3 change villains, the other Red Lotus members, Zahir, Pali, Minghua, and Ghazan. Straight away, the problem is that 3 of those characters we basically know very little about, because they've had so few lines of dialogues. Pali a little bit more than the other 2, but Minghua and Ghazan especially, really, really underdeveloped characters. But overall, the group of 4, I would say the one thing that we're missing in terms of their motivation is, why did they join the Red Lotus? As I said, we don't get Unalaq's motivations for this, but because we explore him much more, in a much more personal sense, and get some backstory on him, we have an idea. With these 4, we just don't know. They're just part of the Red Lotus, and being part of that organization kind of defines what their ideals are. The want for freedom, chaos. They don't agree with world leaders or being imprisoned or anything like that, and that's what their kind of goal is about, to get out the Avatar on their side and train the Avatar to be a more chaotic Avatar and to rid the world of world leaders and let kind of chaos rule over the world, kind of with them more or less being kind of somewhat in control. So the problem is that you get this idea that, okay, it's a good ideal, but it's twisted. But because they're part of the Red Lotus, we never really see why their ideal was ever overly good in the first place. Yes, they oppose bad rulers like Queen Ho Ting and stuff like that, but they immediately, go as far as to kill her. And because they do that straight away, we never get this impression of like they had good ideals initially, and that's the biggest problem with these guys. No backstory really given to us about any of them. We get the slightest backstory that Pali was saved from being this kind of this person who just had to obey a warlord. She was saved from him by Zahir. That's where the relationship comes from. That's perhaps why Pali believes so strongly in freedom, because she was imprisoned earlier on. But the other Red Lotus members were part of the Red Lotus prior to being imprisoned for their failed kidnapping attempt of Korra. So their ideals come from before then. And we don't know why. Like, did something happen to Ming-Hua when she was young? I assume, like, her ideals come to some extent from maybe, not being allowed to train in waterbending when she was younger because she didn't have any arms or something like that, and she saw that as a lack of freedom or something like that. Ghazan having lava bending, was he treated differently because he had that? Maybe those are the explanations for why they believe so strongly in freedom and not having rulers, people in charge. But that's just speculation. None of that is really presented to us as anything that's meant to be behind why they believe in the Red Lotus. Even Zahir, like, there's this implied backstory for him that he's this kind of warrior poet who, like, really looks in depth into the kind of the history of the air nomads. That's why he knows so much. But it's never stated that, like, oh, the reason he gets airbending and is immediately good at airbending is because he's, like, studied it a ton. It's just, like, implied without ever being properly explained. And then even when it comes to the big talk between Zahir and Korra, it's more about the explanation about what the Red Lotus is, as opposed to why the four of them as individuals believe so strongly in what they're doing. And that's what I always miss out from these characters. They are super threatening in terms of what they do, how strong they are at bending, the unique powers they have, and the way they approach doing things. But as characters, individuals, people, I don't feel I know them all that well. I feel like they are just four members of a group that has a leader who is more interesting than them in Unalaq. And I know a lot of people won't agree with me on that because they love the powers of the other Red Lotus members, but for me, Unalaq is a much more interesting Red Lotus member than the four that we get here. Ultimately, I think Book 3 works really well because they fit very nicely into what's going on. I just feel that in terms of something that Avatar and Korra always gets right, character development, focus on the characters, it fails in Book 3 with the villains because we don't know them all that well. So, I think Zahir is made a lot more interesting by his return in Book 4. Unfortunately, they kill off the other three Red Lotus members, so we have very little chance of ever learning anything more about them, which is a huge sad thing to think about, because I think there are potentials for interesting stories, as I said, just because of their powers. This warlord clearly kind of took Pali because of her powers, combustion bending. Something must have happened to Ghazan growing up being a lava bender, and then the nature of how Ming-Hua learned to waterbend without arms in the first place seems like a super interesting story to me. But that's the Red Lotus there. Obviously, I think they ultimately are super popular because Book 3 is a very dark book. It deals with a lot of big things and what the Red Lotus end up doing in terms of the injuries they inflict on Korra and their attempts to kind of kill her at the end, kind of really big them up. But I think fundamentally, in the sense of what I'm discussing here, the villains and their motivations and why they personally believe in it, they are some of the more lacking ones. So let's finish this video off with our book 4 balance villain, Kuvira. Set up in book 3, which is nice. We get a little bit of backstory there, just with the fact that she's this character from Zaofu who we did see a little bit in book 3. The problem with her, though, is that they present her backstory, which is good, but they present it right at the end. They tell us instead of show us her backstory. Really vague, just this idea of like, oh, I was an orphan, abandoned by my parents, and that's why I believe so strongly in kind of having this, solid rule over the Earth Kingdom and stability. Like, it's all about stability for her. She doesn't like chaos, that she reacts to what the Red Lotus did by just creating this super stable situation in the Earth Kingdom, regardless of how she went about doing that. And that's where it came from, is like, cool, but it's kind of vague and very quickly brought up. Like, could you really not have addressed her personal issues earlier on? In that, for me, the thing that's most missing from Kuvira's story is how she suddenly went from being this character who obviously clearly believes in this to like kind of Hitler level leader, where she is imprisoning people who are not originally from the Earth Kingdom and putting them in these kind of re-education camps to basically remove them from the Earth Kingdom and like teach them to be better people. Like, that's this crazy concept, like evil thing that she's doing in terms of imprisoning people just because they're not originally from the Earth Kingdom in a world that is becoming more kind of spread out and diverse. Where did that come from? That's what I'm missing. Where does the villainous kind of side of Kuvira truly come from? And to me, what was missing was that the show seems to imply to us that the big moment where it changes for her is when Sue is asked to basically take over as acting leader of the Earth Kingdom in the obviously aftermath of the chaos caused by the Red Lotus. The Earth Kingdom is without a queen and it's in chaos. She doesn't want to take over because she doesn't want to be seen as any sort of a tyrant or bad ruler, and she disagrees. Kuvira disagrees with the fact that Sue didn't want to do this. She thought Sue should have taken over, and after this, apparently came up with some sort of a plan where she got together with Batar to potentially, for the sole reason of hurting Sue, or because she actually cared about him. Again, very underdeveloped backstory on how that relationship came about. I think the implication is that she wanted someone who was smart enough to kind of bring together her organization in the way she wanted, so she got Batar Jr. on her side that way. I think that's the implication we're meant to take. And she left Zaofu to accomplish the goals in the way she needed to. The problem is that they established that after Kuvira's parents abandoned her, Sue took her in. So effectively, they've been like mother and daughter for like a really long time, but that just doesn't come across. The closeness of that relationship doesn't come across in the show at all, really. There's definitely a sense of betrayal, but it doesn't feel as strong as it should for Sue, who's basically adopted this girl when she was orphaned by her parents. Like, where's the kind of the connection there? Where was the big moment of the rift being formed between them? I don't feel that moment was strong enough to kind of change her so clearly. Now, obviously, clearly she had these ideas in her head, and Sue disagreeing with her, not wanting to accomplish them at all. She left on her own as the leader. She was completely in charge, and these plans, she was able to do whatever she wanted. No one would say no to her. But it was a turn to kind of being overly evil that I didn't quite fully understand. In a sense of, like, as I've discussed already, with Amon, you get why he hates bending, even if it's hypocritical of the way he's approaching, removing bending from people, doing it as a bender. With Unalaq, he's very spiritual. You get why he wants to spread spirituality across the world, and why he doesn't like people who aren't spiritual. And, why he kind of thinks that Vatu is a better approach, because Vatu obviously promotes the idea of spirits being superior to humans, and why kind of he would get into that sort of mentality. The Red Lotus, even to some extent, you kind of get like, okay, there's some slightly implied, stories of like where they're implied like that they really believe in freedom because they never want to be trapped again or anything like that. With Kuvira, it's just like, okay, you want stability because your parents left you, but she was brought into this family and was given a really good position in Zaofu. Now, I don't know if it's meant to be this thing where it's actually a purposeful thing that there wasn't a lot of kind of love between Sue and Kuvira, that maybe she didn't feel part of the family, like Sue's actual kids, but I didn't feel like there was any negativity there. Sue seemed to super trust Kuvira in book 3, and Kuvira seemed to really respect Sue's opinions on things right up until this moment. That moment should have been expanded out so much more, and then their moments where they meet again with Kuvira actually in charge should have been expanded on a lot more as well. And it's why I really hope these Korra comics, when they come out, they have something like a trial of Kuvira, and we get a chance for Kuvira to explain herself a lot better as to why she did this, her thoughts on Sue, and just everything going on. Because to me, Book 4's villain is good. And again, she has these aspects: really cool, powerful bender, like that we got the setup from before, strong connection to a lot of things, similar in a lot of ways to Korra. But what I missed was just her connection to her own motivation, her reasoning for doing what she was doing was missing for me. And that's the fundamental reason why I tend to prefer the villains from the first 2 books to the villains from the second 2 books. In that, again, cool fighters, those villains. But I think Unalaq's also a cool fighter. I think Amon is a really interesting fighter in terms of his bending abilities also. Like, psychic bloodbender, who can bloodbend people with his mind, doesn't need the full moon. Very powerful waterbender, from what we know, and invented a technique where he can take people's bending away permanently, by kind of utilizing kind of a reverse healing process kind of type thing. That's a cool technique. Unalaq, very powerful waterbender, who also developed a new technique of his own with the spirit bending. That was a super cool technique to get, and it becomes a kind of signature technique of Korra's as the series progresses. So that was really cool. And we saw him in the kind of initial parts of the battle with Korra. Really cool kind of dark avatar versus light avatar battle before we got all giant spirits and stuff like that, when they were just kind of, Vatu in Unalaq, and Unalaq was still a lot in control. That was a really big moment. That was cool. I think that a lot of those and their powers and abilities are just as cool as like having a team of with a combustion bender, a lava bender, and stuff like that. I think the Red Loads kind of instantly have an advantage in that there's 4 of them, all with like different elements and special abilities. But Kuvira obviously manages to make up for that with like personality, and she's a really strong metal bender, and then like uses technology a lot as well. So yeah, I think that's more or less all I wanted to say in this video. In the comments, definitely let me know what your thoughts are. I know my general opinion on the villains and the ones I prefer over the ones I don't like as much. Don't really agree with the general fandom opinion, but in the comments do let me know what your thoughts are on what I've said here, and your thoughts on like future discussion topic videos I want to do, that you want me to do, and stuff like that. Again, if you want to guarantee that your topic is chosen for the discussion topic, or if you want to come on one of these Avatar Weekly discussion topics with me, support me on Patreon. Link is in the description to that. But if you want to just normally support my channel, there is a PayPal donation link in the description below, where you can also help, so I can make more of these, make them better and stuff like that. And then last but not least, if you want to follow me on Twitter and Tumblr, where I do occasionally talk about Avatar and stuff like that, links to my Twitter and Tumblr are also in the description below. But other than that, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.